Well, that was a new message. I
I
don't know
didn't
if you
expect
want
to see that.
yeah, I didn't hear that. All right. Well, welcome to another edition of the Subseasonal Forecast Contest. It's Tuesday, May 25th. And we have a special guest here today, Matt Lanza, returning champion, Matt Lanza. Um,
Hello, hello.
all right. And so we're going to initially start off here with the attribution like we normally do. And then we're going to jump into the forecast and let Matt kind of drive that forward. All right, so just a couple quick housekeeping. We also added here at the end the summary for the cooling season 2021. We now have our first official verification for the cooling season. Just one forecast here. But I just want to, in case anyone noticed a little difference here, we added those two tabs so you can see it. Heating season's in the books. We talked a lot about that last week. And actually, Michael, who's on the line, did quite well. I think he was one of the best performers there. All right, so let's start with the week. We'll look at the weekly numbers, which again are going to be pretty similar to the seasonal numbers since there's only one forecast. All right, so this was the forecast made from May 4th, and it verified a couple days ago, May 19th to May 23rd. So the verification came in. This is CDDs now, so this is our first verification in CDDs, pop weighted CDDs. That we get from Maxar. So the verification you can see on the bottom here is close to 29 CDDs. Just to give that some perspective, we had the 30-year normal at close to 20, and the 10-year was about 24. So certainly, warmer than normal, both the 10 and the 30. And you can see, I'll just show you how it looked visually. So this is 19th to 23rd. Oh, I moved this, right? That's about right. Oh, let's start off with temperatures and then we'll maybe come back and look at the 500 millibar pattern. I'll get it right. All right, there we go, right? May 19th, 23rd. So there's the visual, classic kind of, cool in the west and warm or above normal anyway across much of the east and Midwest, with the important exception of some areas across the Gulf Coast. Important because, we're talking CDD. So if some of these areas, obviously down in Texas and Georgia and whatnot, were a little bit hotter, this forecast could have even been hotter yet. So, but here's how it looked in terms of the CDDs. Like we talked about, there's your 28.7. There's the benchmarks we talked about, and there's where it ranked historically. So, or at least since 1950, looks like about number 8. In terms of who did good performance, and some of the performances not as good. Interesting here, this is like this works out great sometimes it doesn't. But persistence, the 5-day persistence worked out well for this forecast. But again, sometimes this can obviously completely backfire on you. So be wary before you assume like, hey, persistence is a good forecast. Take a look at some of these seasonal numbers on the persistence, because it definitely has not been over a long period of time a good predictor, at least compared to normal. Looks like I did pretty well on this one. Michael did pretty well near the top, and Philip also. So we had a number of forecasters. Professor Decker, who I think is on the line, also did well against as compared to the 30-year normal. And Professor Lupo, who also I think joined here, is also did well as compared to the 30-year. But it was interesting here. And unfortunately, I don't think we have some of the folks who didn't, perform as well. It'd just be interesting to hear the different perspectives, because, some of these forecasts we'll look at and we have, everyone's on kind of the same side. And it's like, either everyone did pretty well or everyone, did not. But we actually had, some of our historically good performers here who struggle a little bit. Paul did a little bit below the 30-year. Dave D'Arcangelo had kind of a cooler forecast there. Industry, that's Maxar, which did quite well this winter. They went on the cooler side of things. And then even Matt Rogers, the CFS, really struggled on this forecast too. So it was an interesting spectrum here. I think let's see, I'm just trying to take us back, right? This was coming off, we definitely had some cooler periods here. So this is what, May 4th, right? So when we think about that period, let's just go back a little bit. So what were we looking at coming out of May 4th there? So it was like April. Can't do that.
It's funny. I'm actually just jumping in while you do this and looking back
Yep.
at my notes. I was unable to submit on the 4th. And in fact, I was looking back at my notes with my forecast on the 4th. I guess I was out of the office that day. So, but I was looking at what I was writing on the 3rd and the 5th, and even a couple days around that. And it looked to me like um, I felt that at least my analog driven approach was quite warm in the north in the 16 to 20 day around that time. And I was kind of favoring a warmer north, cooler south, which didn't exactly work out entirely. But I think I was probably, had I put in a forecaster, I probably would have been probably between the 10 and the 30 years. So I probably would have come in the low 20s. Not great, not terrible, but yeah, it just looking at old CFS model.
Yeah.
And that had cool temps over the the central US, right where the heart of the aboves are. So it's not optimal. I think that whole period was sort of like a low predictability type period, or I guess lower than average.
Yeah, I mean that's a good point too, right? It's not like, I mean, we did, we talked about persistence. I just had that map up. You can see why persistence was good because we were coming off a 5-day period that was warmer than normal. But yeah, I mean, you look at some of our models that we typically use, right, as part of our forecast process, and it definitely steered you the wrong way. I mean, it's like even the EC was pretty bland, and it wasn't. I was cheating on this earlier. I think I was looking at the also even from like sometimes the CFS. It gets the surface wrong, but maybe it had the upper level right. Is kind of one of those things where if you just bias correct, you get it right in terms of the surface. But here, I'll pull up now the 500, and I mean, not very helpful, right? I'll just flip back and forth a little bit. The sort of the PNA configuration, kind of starting out in the Pacific and then kind of looking, then extending that out into the US. I mean, this is kind of what the GFS was showing, or CFS. And this is web verified. It's like flip it, right? And then you would have had it perfect. So not so good there. Let's look at the EC. There's your EC. Again, I mean, better. I think you could argue it was a little bit better, maybe, than the CFS. It was more muted, maybe a little bit more ridging in the east, but still not great, right? I mean, still didn't capture the fact that there was a full scale trough here in the western states. Obviously, it wasn't. It didn't give a strong hint of that. And let's look at and folks feel free to continue to jump in. I'm just going to say let's take a look at. So what did I say? This was like May 4th or whatever. So back on May 4th, we were in a strong phase 1 signal. And let's look, I'm just curious here at this tool. Where did I close it already? Oh no, I have it here somewhere. Our MJO tool. I think I got it here. There we go. Yeah, I remember, I think this was part of my logic for what it's worth. I felt like the MGO signal was about as strong warm as you could get. I think I'm going to go back to my logic here. Yeah, I added a +5 fudge factor. I'm just reading my notes. In addition, it appears that MJ is moving into a strong warm signal, so I'm adding a little extra to account for this. Yeah, that was, I don't know if that's really what happened, but I was concerned that maybe the models were underestimating the fact that we had, not just a moderate signal, but a strong signal that seemed to be in the I'm accounting for some noise here. There's a little bit of weak spots here, but I'm assuming that some noise, that it was in this really strong area, projection for, stronger than normal temperatures. But let me open it up to some other folks here too. Maybe Michael, do you have any thoughts on this forecast, lessons learned, or any of the things that how you approach this?
Let me see what I said for this week. I don't remember.
Yeah, I can pull it up here while you're talking too. Starting off with a base value of 22, I made no change to my forecast based on the teleconnections beyond the weaker side with no clear signal in my opinion. I increased my value by about 2.5 based on the CPC forecast. So the Professor Decker kind of route there, or methodology.
Yeah, I mean that seems to be all I had. So basically, I've noticed this works a little bit better in the summer using the 10-year. It's kind of like a baseline to start instead of the 30-year is usually a good strategy. Especially nowadays when it seems that every summer we're breaking the previous record or in top 3 or top 5 warmest summers, using the much warmer 10-year usually helps a lot with getting closer to actual verifications.
I tell you though, I think, and Matt might be able to speak to this a little bit. I haven't looked at the forecast that closely over the last week, but I think there's a lot of bouncing back and forth here in terms of. Point is, I think there's going to be some interesting verifications here over the next month, right? I mean, obviously this was a warm one, and this worked out for those folks that use sort of that logic, which I use too, by the way, Michael. Like, just hey, I'm going to fade cool chances here because the summers tend to work out warm and yada yada. But just looking at here, I'll just pull it up real quick. Looking at some of these forecasts here, forecast periods over the next couple weeks potential. Like here's the 1 to 5 most recent. We're looking at the most recent Euro weeklies here. You see extended. So it's basically the next 5 days. Not super warm, right, at all. Here's a 6 to 10. Certainly not super warm. Probably cooler than normal, even the 30-year. So that's I can't remember how this matches up exactly with our verifications, but if this comes forward, this is certainly not going to be something that's above the 10-year, let alone even the 30-year. 11 to 15 starts to warm up a little bit, and then there's 16 to 20, which obviously is what we're talking about today. So it could be a little bit of a wild ride. I don't know, Matt, do you have any, like in terms of this summer CDDs, are folks still in the market kind of pretty confident that, hey, trend, hot summer, it's unavoidable, 10-year, maybe 10-year plus, or is there any concern here in the market that that some of this variability could be a long-term kind of signal for the summer?
Yeah, I think that I actually rehashed my summer outlook last week, and for work here, and I was expecting to make some changes, and I actually didn't, because everything I was looking at was just like, maybe it's like 5 CDDs here or there, and I really don't like to fudge that little with a 2 or 3 month ahead forecast. So to me, it still looks like a 10-year normal-ish type summer, which if you had a 10-year normal summer start to finish, that would be your 7th hottest, I think, since 1950. So which is kind of remarkable when you think about it. But that seems to be it's still my starting point. I'm not going to lie that at least my forecast for June, which actually has been lagging some of the others in that have been out there. I know there have been some June forecasts that were, up around like 270, 280, and I've been down in the 250s for a couple months now. That may actually hold up okay. But I've even been thinking the last few days, do I need to start cutting June? I took another look at it this morning. And I'm like, yeah, I'm not really ready to do that yet. But I mean, if we still get these cool looking maps coming in, I mean, it's going to create something. I think that, I don't know. I sort of alluded to this in some notes last week, actually, when it started raining in Texas. I thought that was kind of a big deal for, the ERCOT market, at least, because you start getting, I think the expectations coming into the summer were that there was risk for a drought in the central US. And I think a lot of those concerns have been washed away for better or worse over the last week or so. And I think that has an impact on people. I think sometimes the soil moisture card gets played a little too loosely. Like, oh, we've got dry soils in May, so it's going to be a hot summer, and like, well, it can change pretty fast. Same thing with it being this wet now. It doesn't mean that you're not going to have a summer, you're going to have a muted summer in Texas or something. But I think that's been kind of a point of focus for the last several days, and probably will continue to be a point of focus, going into the next week or two, because Texas looks like it continues to be wet. One of the things I found that's kind of interesting, just in terms of forecasts, is that sometimes when you get these wet patterns over Texas, the models, particularly the Euro, tends to get a little too excited about how cool it's going to be after a wet period. So, if we do suddenly turn off the faucet here, maybe it won't be quite as cool as what has been shown on some of the ensemble models going forward. So I think that's kind of another talking point going into June that maybe gives me a little bit of pause about being too aggressive with how far I want to cut, going into next month. So, there's definitely been, there's definitely concerns. You get people this time of year that'll start asking like, these 11 to 15 maps really aren't coming in quite that warm. You're really sure that summer's going to be hot? And I think you just kind of have to stay the course for the time being, unless you're convicted. And I'm just not really that convicted just yet.
Yeah, I think that's really helpful. And what was it? Was it three? Was it 3 years ago? What is it? God, I'm losing track. It's 2021. So was it the summer of 2018, which was one of the summers that was like super hot, like one of the hottest? Let me go back here. Let's just look at 16.
I think it was. I think it was either 18 or 19.
I have okay, 18 was number 5. 16, I guess. This is the June to August period. May. So the bottom line is, though, it's too early, you think, at this point. Okay, yeah, if you include from May to September, 2018 was the warmest on record there. Just let's see. I'm just curious what the 18 looked like.
And I think that there's something to be said about I mean, I personally think it's a little too early to get too worked up about it, but at the same time, I think that there is something to be said, like, okay, if you do end up with a lot of rain in the beginning of summer, you are going to reduce probably the risk of your extremes, right? You're really getting out of hand 105 plus temperatures across parts of Texas. And I think that there may be something to be said about that, because there's a big difference between having a few days, or a week or two where it's 103 to 106 versus 97 to 101, perception wise and impact, within the market. I think it's a big deal. So if you can sort of eliminate that higher end risk a little bit, that's valuable information. Again, I don't think we're quite there yet, but that's something I think we're going to be watching in the days and weeks ahead.
Well, Matt, just at least my last question on this subject. So you kind of alluded. So the takeaway seems there. Tell me if I'm wrong, but too early. You think that, to get nervous or whatever about making a big change in the forecast, because some of the variability we're seeing here. Obviously, not super hot May, but kind of the message here is just because it's not super hot May, It's also not a super cold May. I think it's somewhere between the 10 and 30 year, and it's not a reason to dramatically, increase expectations for June, July, August. With a little bit of a caveat that, okay, a little bit wetter, but maybe soil moisture, soil moisture is something you have to watch, but it's maybe like a secondary thing, and it may control some of the extremes a little bit, or fade things a little bit, a couple CDDs here or there, but it's still not enough yet to be hey, this is going to drive a summer that's going to be well below the 10-year kind of thing. Are there
Right.
are there any other things though that you look at that you can talk about now that that if they do move in a certain and I guess let's just talk about cold risk, we'll bias ourselves, but what are the things over the next couple of weeks that if they moved in a certain direction would concern you about more cold risks to the forecast? Like a certain pattern developing, a certain climate signal, a certain teleconnection signal. Are there any things that you look at now that would give you some more concern about those cold signals?
I think that for me personally, I like to see what the flavor of the pattern is going into early June in terms of is there anything that's repetitive? Do we have like a persistent ridge in the west or a persistent ridge in the east? Something like that. So what I want to watch is, I think, first of all, this wet Texas pattern, does it continue? Because if it continues going into June, then I'm going to be a little bit more skeptical about anchoring heat in the South Central, right? And so then right there, that kind of gives you a little bit of a reason to be concerned about a hot forecast verifying, or at least something in the upper echelon. If we get a ridge that starts to anchor more on the West Coast, if we start getting more, a hotter signal for California, or, even the interior West kind of going into the first part of June, to me, that would argue that, okay, we need to be cautious about, how warm we're going to go in the Midwest and in the East if we have that kind of, pattern trying to anchor itself into things. And I think likewise, it's seeing like there's been a pretty good signal, and I think we'll talk about that with today's forecast, like Quebec, Northeast, in New England, for kind of a ridge or at least higher heights up there. If that continues, that's another reason to not necessarily think a cool forecast, but just a different kind of flavor of a warm forecast that's maybe not as extreme, because I mean, heat in Boston is one thing, relative to, New York or Philly or DC or something like that. So I think that's another thing to kind of keep an eye on. And then obviously ENSO, I think we want to watch to make sure that we don't have like a developing El Nino, as the summer goes on. I know with La Nina sort of on the wane, if we go into an El Nino direction a little faster than expected, then maybe the back part of summer could be a little bit cooler, or something like that. So I mean, that's another thing to kind of keep an eye on. So those are just kind of like the littler things I would watch right now. I think that I'm kind of a believer in repetition sometimes, that if we end up in one sort of setup or pattern or something early on that seems to last for a little while, call it more than a week or two, there's a good chance that we're going to see that again. And if you start eliminating, 1 to 2 weeks of heat, then you can start to make a play to cut your CDD forecast, I think, for summer. So there's a little bit of strategy involved in it too, in addition to the meteorology.
Yeah, that makes sense. Kind of trying to get ahead of the market a little bit. Okay. All right. If are there any other questions on the previous forecast? Otherwise, we will look into the future. All right. So let's see. I'll just set the stage here real quick. Here, I'll sort this by forecast, the centerline forecast mean. Again, today's 25th, right? So it looks like we've got, let's see, the 10-year is about 40. The 30-year is about 35.5. So those are kind of our benchmarks there. The top warmest is persistence. Again, at which kind of makes sense. So if you want to roll the dice and go with persistence, 44.6. A trend is also pretty hot here. And then on the lower end, we've got Matt Rogers at 35. persistence, the 15-day persistence at 33. And then Josh Herman, I have to check with Josh to make sure he's calibrated, but if he's at 18. So that's kind of it. So Matt, yeah, maybe I'll where are you, Matt? There's Matt. Matt's at 40 here. So kind of on the warmer end of things. So it looks like the only human forecast warmer than Matt is Michael. So it'll be interesting to hear from Michael too. But yeah, Matt, why don't you kick us off and talk about the forecast and any interesting challenges here?
Yeah, I think that one of the challenges here, I mean, so personal challenge for me today is just kind of getting back up to speed. So actually, this is kind of good because it sort of allows me to kind of talk through things a little bit, as I'm kind of, getting back to trying to get back to normal here. So I felt one of the things I felt this week was that there was a pretty nice linkage between what was showing up in the ensemble models in the late 11 to 15 day and what the CFS and the Euro weeklies are showing kind of going into the 16 to 20 or into the week 3 period, where it was sort of a logical extension of things. And sometimes there could be a little bit of a discontinuity there or a disconnect, but I felt like it was sort of a logical progression of things. So I actually put a little bit more weight on the climate models than I typically do. I think 50% is what I put today, or which is, I don't know if I've ever done anything quite that high with the CFS and Euro. And just in kind of looking at everything, I felt that the best trick was just to kind of go close to Climo, specifically 10-year, because there were a couple things that were sort of mixed that make it a little bit challenging. Number one, the period starts off, I think if you want to pull up that Euro weekly map, I think you had a Euro weekly map or a CFS map of 500 millibar heights for week 3. There's that big old signal for high heights over Quebec and in New England and into the Maritimes. And I felt that, so that probably skews the Northeast to the warm side going into the 16 to 20. And again, that was something that was showing up in 11 to 15 as well. I feel like that's a signal that doesn't necessarily fade that quickly. So, my thinking is that, Boston, probably New York to a lesser extent, and also maybe even Chicago, some of the Great Lakes cities will probably be above normal. So, right away you're hitting pretty heavy population with above normal temps. And even though it's still early in summer, you're still going to add up some CDDs there, right? So, okay, that to me says that we have to be probably a little bit closer to Climo than maybe I otherwise would be in this pattern. The big question I have is what happens in the West. Well, two questions I have. One is West, one is Texas. But with the West, you've got this signal for a ridge or higher heights, kind of a ridge building over south of the Gulf of Alaska. Is there any chance that builds on shore in the West Coast, in which case you would start racking up some CDDs in California and possibly, some of the interior cities, Phoenix, Vegas, even though the pop weighting is not huge there, it would still skew above normal in that situation, or is that ridge kind of stay where it is and you actually end up with cooler risks kind of in the Pac Northwest? So I'm a little conflicted about what to expect out West, and that makes the forecast a little bit challenging. The other aspect is Texas, and like sort of what I alluded to before, when you're coming, sort of out of a wet pattern in Texas, sometimes there can be the soil moisture feedback issue in the Euro, where it tends to think the temps are going to be below normal forever. I don't know if you have a surface temperature map at all for anomaly map for the 11. So there you go. You can see that there. So you've got the below normal temps. So is that a function of A, it's still a wet pattern, B, it's been wet, so the model thinks it's going to stay cool, or I don't know if there's a C, but anyway, one of those two. I think that creates some uncertainty, and I think Texas is a big wild card because it's big CDDs, right? So if you end up below normal in Texas, then you're probably going to end up slightly, to the downside, maybe closer to the 30-year normal than the 10-year. Whereas if you end up average or above average in Texas, you're probably going to end up closer to the 10-year or slightly above that. So, that's something to watch. I don't know if we're quite ready for the wet pattern to shut off just yet. Looking at the 11 to 15 day to try and get a sense as to whether the rains are going to continue here. It still looks wet, though not as wet as it does, in the near term. So I think that's going to be, something to keep a close eye on. So there you can see that 11 to 15 days, still a little bit of a wet pattern. across the southern plains in Texas. So you're not going to really get a ton of heat, in that kind of pattern. And the best you're going to do is Climo, but probably below. So I think it creates some challenges. I feel, fairly confident about the Northeast. I'm interested to see what happens in the West, and Texas, I really don't have a good feel on yet. And I think one of the other things that's kind of interesting to point out in the 11 to 15, is that it's not just Texas and the plains that's wet. It's above normal precip across a good chunk of the East. So this could be a situation where temps are somewhat depressed and dew points are higher, so you still end up with a pretty good dose of demand, but it's not going to meet the CDD forecast you would expect with that. So I think that's something to kind of keep an eye on as well. If that continues, that's going to be another thing to watch going into summer. If we have a wetter east, that will certainly dampen literally the risk for heat going into, especially the first half of summer. So something to keep an eye on there. I don't know how that looks. Do we have a Euro weekly precip by chance? I'm just curious to see what the anomalies are for that in the 16 to 20 or week 3, whatever. There we go. Okay. So yeah, so it's still technically kind of wet, but you do start to see some drier conditions show up, in Houston, Louisiana. That would help, get us a little bit hotter here in Houston. Maybe we could get above 90 for a more sustained period and start generating some more CDDs there. But, northern plains, Midwest, upper Midwest looks like it's still a little bit on the wet side. So, some risks there. I think that, this is one thing I haven't been paying attention to. I think it's worth kind of looking at. I'll actually pull this up. Is a drought monitor. I wanted to see the Northeast. I thought I had seen anecdotally that the Northeast was kind of going into a drought. I guess it's not that bad, but it's a little dry. So, whatever. There's some dryness up there, so that could help with higher heights overhead. Maybe just give a little bit of extra juice to the Northeast or the Great Lakes. In the 16 to 20 a day to bump up CDDs a little. So, you can tell I'm just kind of like, I don't really have a strong conviction one way or the other. So I feel like going Climo is probably appropriate given all this. Less because I'm going Climo and more because I feel like the signals are mixed enough that that's the best place to be. So that was sort of the strategy involved in what I decided.
Okay. You have a fan, Professor Lupa.
Just saw that.
Good agreement. Good agreement.
All right.
Any questions for Matt on his forecast process here? I have one question. If give others a chance to think about it. I just, not to beat to death the soil moisture thing, but since we've been talking about it and you brought it up a couple times too, it's I'm trying to think like I guess it's a question comment. It feels to me like as I think about some of what this is a sort of a just experiential. I don't have hard numbers, but over the last 10, 15 years, and you kind of alluded to this, it seems like the soil moisture relationship, the precipitation relationships become a little bit more complicated. Like I think there have been some summers in the last 10, 15 years where it was like, I think the start of it might have been like the summer of 2010 or 11, I can't remember, but like where it was super wet in the Midwest. And a lot of folks were still falling back on if it's super wet, yeah, of course it's not going to be that hot in the Midwest. And it was like really hot. And I think that opened up some concerns that, hey, maybe, with climate shifts or whatever, that relationship is evolving and changing. Do you have any thoughts on that? Like, or have you looked at that in terms of how and I'm not, not even not at the level of max and min temperatures, because I think there's probably still, more there in terms of, controlling max temperatures or something like that. But just in terms of overall national CDDs, how that relationship looks in the past 10 years, the correlation relationship, whatever, versus how it looks over whatever that length of time series we have, 30, 40 years.
Yeah, I don't really have a good feeling for exactly what's happened, but I agree with you that in the last, 10, particularly last 10 years, I feel like there's been more emphasis on the soil moisture and kind of the dew point argument, that, you know, it's not so much that you're going to generate the CDDs because of the, you know, the actual temperature and everything, but you're going to generate, you know, basically, you know, whatever you want to call it, heat index, real feel, whatever, for you know, the combination of the moisture and a warm air mass, right? So I think that there's probably some, and this is something I wish I had time to actually sit down and do, to see if you could get a better performing forecast from a demand perspective if you did sort of like, instead of max temp, what is max heat index going to be on a particular day, you know, for a number of different cities across, you know, particularly the eastern US and the central US, you know, because of that argument. Because I do feel like there's been several instances where we've had, you know, wetter summers or wetter late springs, and you end up getting just kind of these blah CDD outcomes. They're still above normal, but it's less extreme and more just consistent and persistent. I think that's been one of the other things is the last couple of summers. I don't think we've had a ton of extreme heat in some of the big cities, more so than we've had just this persistent above normal, you know, every day kind of deal. You know, particularly with the night times, that has, you know, generated, I think, a little bit more demand, and has sort of almost, I don't want to say artificially inflated the CDD numbers, because it hasn't, but it's just come up with, it's just created a different kind of summer outcome than maybe what we were used to, say in a year like 2011, where you had a lot of extreme heat, in 2012, another one, you know, so it's been interesting, I think, and I think it's something that merits more research.
Yeah, I like it's interesting. Yeah. I think how you put it, it almost sounded like, and I, for what it's worth, I tend to kind of think this way a little bit too. Again, I don't have any hard data, but it's like, maybe you know, the wetness still will mitigate, you know, the ability for extreme high temperatures, Chicago, New York, you know, things like that. But it may not mitigate much, or at least have a relatively minor impact in terms of setting up patterns. So you still may get, you know, like last year or whatever, you get these patterns that could set up and be very persistent, and so in the end give you very strong CDDs, probably lifted up by the low temperatures. But it's still relevant in the sense, because of course, you know, especially for power traders and things like that, markets like that, you know, the difference between 100 and 95 is important, right? So, you know, you still want to know if the pattern's going to be conducive for, you know, those kind of extreme temperatures, and that could be related somewhat still to exactly, you know, the conditions of the soil moisture at the time of those events and things. And then I was just seeing on our chat, Dr. Lupo, yeah, mentioned that 2011 was the year I was trying to think about, where there was a lot of precipitation across the Midwest, but CDDs I think were still quite high. Yeah, heat index, right, is really important there. All right, let's see. Matt, were there any other thoughts on the current forecast, or we can see if someone else wants to share their forecast strategy today?
Yeah, I would like to hear what others have to say about this, because to me it was, I was just kind of sitting here and I'm just kind of like, yeah, I don't really have, yeah, I mean, we'll just kind of go, like I said, go Climo, and we'll see what happens, right? So it'll be very interesting to see what the next couple of weeks start to offer, because I think it's going to be important in determining both, you know, June and balance of summer, how you want to proceed from the next couple of weeks. So I'd be curious what other people's thoughts are.
Well, okay, let's Michael, why don't we see what you're thinking here today? And I think one thing that caught my eye that's interesting is, you know, you and Matt were the warmest human forecasters, and pretty close in terms of numbers. But it was interesting. One thing that stuck with me from Matt was, you know, putting, you know, relatively significant weighting on the dynamic guidance, and emphasizing that. And when I look at your strategy, Michael, we say not too much weight on the dynamic guidance, much more weight on the teleconnections, but again, you got to the same place. So why don't you walk us through that a little bit?
Yeah, so basically, kind of ran into a similar um, situation from what we just read from the the previous forecast just verified. So I looked at the teleconnections, didn't see a really clear signal. Everything looked to be hovering around neutral. So I didn't make any changes there. I did have my starting value was pretty high, I guess, compared to the other forecasters, since I used the 10-year as a base and kind of weighted with the euro a little bit. But the euro and the 10-year were basically the same, so I started essentially at the 10-year. So yeah, the only thing that caused me to raise my forecast a little bit was the CPC. Didn't have a lot of warm on there, but they did have warm along the East Coast and along the West Coast. And now the West Coast isn't like a big producer, but LA, I guess San Diego and Sacramento can produce some CDD value there, and of course the East Coast we all know, New York, Philly, etc., above average. So I didn't go too far into that, considering when I see equal chance in the middle of the country with warm on both sides, it kind of makes me hesitate a little bit. There might be a little bit of cooler temps up in the north. Doesn't show that here, but I'm a little wary of that. But the East Coast warmth, I kind of figured, okay, a lot of cities along the East Coast, I can kind of bump up my value a little bit here. So that was my thought process with that.
Yeah, and we are, it's fun. I mean, we are, I can attest, being on the East Coast here, we finally getting to a point where, when you get those warm days, we had a couple recently, and then, I think tomorrow, you definitely need, it's now like late enough in the season where, when you're a few degrees above normal, you're definitely putting on the AC, or at least I am, and it's definitely hot out, it's getting 90 and stuff like that. So just, I think your point about, the mid-Atlantic up through, New York City and stuff, it's starting to matter versus, early in May, late April, if it's a few degrees above normal and the humidity is not there yet, you can probably still get away with, not worrying about that as much. Let's see, any questions for Michael about his forecast process today or outcome?
No questions, but I think it's bring up a good point about cities on the East Coast and things like that. And I feel like there's a little bit of strategy that kind of goes into this in terms of how you want to come up with your number and how you want to fudge it based on exactly where it is. Like if you think New York or you think Boston or Philly can get into a little bit of above normal, I think that changes your whole dynamic, and that you can have a pattern where it just looks like garbage on a map, but you've just got a couple of these key cities that have just ended up on the hot side, and it just you end up with a completely different CDD number compared to what your map actually you feel like it looks like. So I think it's important to kind of be cognizant of that when you're going through a forecast and you're trying to come up with a number for somebody to use, because that can easily roll you and deceive you if you're not paying close attention.
And I want to let Dr. Lupo go here in a second, but I just real quick, when I think about my forecast process today, I think that was what Matt just mentioned was my biggest concern. So I went a little bit, I guess, on the cooler end of the distribution. You can see me down here, and I was playing the MJO card again. Sort of long story short, the MJOs, looking at the same tools I looked at earlier, just concerned that it could be a cool factor, but. And one of the reasons why I had my spread a little bit higher than normal, my concern was the East Coast and exactly what you, Michael, and Matt were talking about, that I feel like if I'm going to get burned here, it's going to be exactly kind of this kind of thing where you might get a decent area of coverage of whatever normal-ish or cool, but then that ridge could set up just right, such that this area right here gets hit and CDDs end up, exactly where, you guys are, maybe even higher, 40, 45 or something like that. So I think that'll be a really interesting thing to watch. Michael, I don't know if you have the meeting notes open, but if you do, maybe that'd be I think an important thing to watch or mention, just to kind of, keep track of what happens in the Mid-Atlantic and how much that influences the outcome here. All right. Let's see, Dr. Lupo, I think you're still on the line here.
Yes.
Yeah, would
Yes.
you like to talk about your forecast process today?
Yeah, we noticed a lot of the similar things Matt said, which led to my comment of agreed 100%. A couple of things that we noticed is that we seem to finally break out of that spell of a lot of blocking that we had in April and May. I looked at some of the analogs, previous year analogs, La Nina type analogs, and the La Nina type analogs were so the spread was very small, and they were very close to the 10-year normal. And so my initial thought was to go right around 40 where some of the others went, but Joe kind of talked me down out of that. He was noticing some of the cooler temperatures that the model was projecting for the middle and the west. And we saw some of the CPC analogs that he creates for week 3 and 4. It was iffy as to whether it would be cold in the west or warm in the west. But the East Coast, of course, is showing warmer. So my concern is that we get burned a little bit there. No pun intended, but so he talked me down a little bit and we ended up with 37.5. So.
Okay. Do you see any, it seemed like maybe there, if I'm hearing you, the skew might be to higher. Is that fair? Or do you think the skew is equally distributed on this 37.5? If you're wrong.
If we're wrong, if we're wrong, I think it would be higher.
Okay.
That if we're going to be wrong, it's going to be on the higher end of things. And I really think that the West is going to determine that, or what happens out there. And a little bit about what happens in here, in the middle. Forecasts have been extremely volatile over the middle part of the country recently. But of course, this isn't the main population driver, so.
Yeah. Okay. Any questions for Dr. Lupo or about his process? I had one question. If let's pull up your forecast map here too.
Oh yeah, go ahead.
What do you? I see that you mentioned the SOI, things like that. Do you also, explicitly or implicitly kind of account for, or how do you look at the MGO? Do you look at it as an important driver or not? Or
oh yeah, Joe and I talked about that, and he saw the MJO. I was going to mention that. I forgot to mention that he saw what you saw about the MJO, and that's kind of what brought his thought process into bringing the temperatures down a bit.
okay.
Or the CDDs.
This is actually old. Let me right here. And I have a question I know we just have a couple minutes. And so this question will open it up to Dr. Lupo or Matt, whoever wants to jump in. But one of the things I struggled with the MGO, I feel like, I don't know. I feel like I've seen this movie before, and it could go one of two ways. You've got this MJO, right? The forecast is it's in phase 5. It's a good signal, right? Decent amplitude, whatever. According to the models, it's going to weaken now, and then maybe reemerge in 7, but it's going to get knocked down a bit, right? I think both models show that it's going to get knocked down, and maybe the GFS shows a little bit more of a bump up, but knockdown. And I bring this up, and I think it's potentially important because let me pull up my this guy. I got too many windows open now. So when we look at so this again, this is our tool that's you can access through the website. Um, and this shows kind of like historical empirical relationships. So I'm looking at around this time of year, June, early June, late May. And I'm looking at a lag time of 16 to 20 days. So it kind of matches our forecast. So basically it says, this is saying, all right, find where you are contemporaneously, currently. And then, this is the historical signal 16, 20 days later. So what do we say? We're somewhere around, here, we're phase 5-ish. And so when I look at this, I look at this and I say, I think what this is telling me is if this signal does not break down and the models are wrong and that it's a stronger signal, more progressive over the next week or so, then there's more likely to be the kind of influence as indicated by these cold influences, right? I wish I had the pattern corresponding to it, but my guess is some sort of positive PNA type response, right? More amplification,
Yeah.
right? But and that reminds me of some of the Matt was talking about some of the El Nino years and this and that, and I've seen this. Like I think in some of the years where we have had some of the colder outcomes, we had these spikes in these areas as we got into summer, and we had some of those cool downs. On the other hand, and I don't have hard dates right now, but I also think I remember situations that basically evolved exactly like the models are showing they will evolve. Whether they do or not, we'll see. But that, it looks like you're going to go into these colder phases, but it gets shut down, maybe because of a Rossby wave. I don't know. I didn't look enough detail, but it's suggesting that something's going to undermine this. And so that's sort of my question here. I guess I feel like this could be an important, maybe not important for the entire summer. I don't want to get too crazy here, but at least an important sort of evolution here in terms of what the first 2-3 weeks of June. Are the models right in that the MGO is really going to cut off as it moves into those colder phases, central West Pacific, or are the models underestimating, like they sometimes do, right? They underestimate the progression of the NGO. They say it's going to weaken. It never weakens. It ends up moving into these colder phases, maybe because ENSO is moving, certainly it's moved from La Nina to neutral. And maybe there's a little bit more oomph here, and maybe we do get surprised in terms of getting some colder, or at least more variable regimes. Does anyone, all right, I'm going to stop now. Does anyone have any thoughts on that sort of thread?
No, I think you bring up a good point, and I'll freely admit that my use and knowledge of MJO stuff is probably it's inferior to some others for sure. There's a lot of people that are a lot smarter about this kind of stuff than I am. One thing that I've tried to teach myself a little bit just by following some smarter people, like Paul, like Mike Ventris, that are kind of more experts in this sort of thing. And I've really been I've started using the Hofmahler plots more, the 200 millibar velocity potential plots to try and get a sense as to whether or not I feel like what's being shown on the Wheeler diagrams is actually legitimate, or if there's something to be said there that that maybe you've got a couple areas of convection and the Wheeler plots are a little more confused just about, well, what phase MJO is that in around the tropics. At least that's how I interpret it, and that's how I've sort of been taught to interpret it. And I feel one of the reasons I didn't really go too into MJO this week as a strong signal was because I felt that as you get out into days 13, 14, 15, and extrapolate that into the 16 to 20 day, that you've got quite a few areas of convection around the tropics that I don't know which I don't feel like I have a good handle on which one is going to be dominant in terms of possibly being that MJO wave. I feel like it's getting closer to some of those cooler phases, but I don't have enough confidence to really buy all in. Going out in time. So that was one of my reasons for doing that. I feel like sometimes that's that I don't know if it definitely doesn't always explain it, but I feel like sometimes it explains why we see sort of what we see. In that I feel like the Wheeler diagrams are good at times, and then when you get into the situation where you lose a strong MJO wave and you have like something that's a little bit more moderate or weak, then it just kind of gets blown up and things get funky and strange stuff starts to happen. And I feel like I've learned to distrust them more than I should. But just treating them with a lot of skepticism. And basically what I'm saying is I think you bring up a good point, is that sometimes it feels like the models get confused and they lose things or, too soon, or sometimes the opposite's true, where they're too strong with it and then it, craters back into the the neutral middle, and, it just becomes messy. So I don't know if that makes sense.
It does. I mean, I like
No.
I like how you bring up too that there are some other tools we haven't had a chance to show them more, but where you can actually dissect the Wheeler-Hendon a little bit more. It does have 3 components to 200 millibar winds, 850 OLR, and I think it is interesting to try to understand a little bit more about what's really driving this MJO wave and what forces are working against it and stuff. And it's not an easy answer. But I'm sorry, Dr. Lupo, were you going to say something?
No, I was gonna say that Matt's analysis of that sounded very reasonable, looking at the different factors contributing to the possibilities of which way this MJO could go. I was gonna say, look at the convection, but he already did, so.
Yeah. Well, that might be a good place to leave it then, as it seems like we often leave it where with more uncertainty or more questions and answers, but I think that's part of the process, right? So I think this will be definitely a good one to follow up on, to see how this MJO event actually, how it evolves over the next couple of weeks, and in turn, the pattern response to it. So we'll come back to this as an attribution here in 2 or 3 weeks, I guess, see how things play out. But in the meanwhile, Matt, Dr. Lupo, everyone, thanks for joining us today.
Oh, you're
Thank
welcome.
you, guys.
You're welcome.
Appreciate being here.
Take care. All right, take care. We'll talk to you soon.
Bye, y'all.
Bye.
Bye.